They once called the Titanic the ship of dreams, a testament to human intellect, wealth, and pride at the dawn of the 20th century. In April 1912, Titanic departed Southampton for New York on her maiden voyage. On board were more than 2,200 people, the wealthy strolling across lavish carpets, the poor huddled in cramped compartments, each carrying a private hope. The ship was proclaimed unsinkable, and that belief became a kind of false charm, convincing people that extra preparation was unnecessary. The lifeboats on board were legal, but the law is cold, and the sea does not care about the law. There were not enough for everyone, and at the time that did not spark panic, because when you believe you are invincible, risk becomes something that happens to other people. 4 days after leaving port, Titanic drifted through the North Atlantic, where the water lay unnervingly still and the air felt like glass. That night, ahead of the bow, the lookout saw a pale mass, an iceberg. It didn't charge like an enemy, it simply sat there. And sometimes what kills a dream doesn't need to shout. It only needs to appear at the wrong moment. Titanic tried to turn, but it was too late. Her starboard side was sliced open below the waterline. There was no thunderous explosion, no cinematic impact, just a silent, freezing, fatal wound, a cut deep enough for the ocean to begin doing what it does best, taking space. Distress signals were sent out, but the Atlantic was vast, and the nearest ship was still hours away. In those few short hours, Titanic began to change. From a symbol of progress, she became a race against time. Every passing minute made the hull heavier, lower, more desperate. In less than 3 hours, it was over. Titanic broke in two. Then the enormous ship slipped beneath the surface, taking with it the lights, the groan of twisting metal, and prayers shredded by the wind. But the tragedy didn't end with the sinking. It lived on in the way people were forced to leave. In the chaos, lifeboats were lowered with empty seats. Some pulled away amid screams and confusion, shaped by rushed decisions and mistakes that could never be undone. On the decks, thousands remained, not because they chose to, but because there was nowhere left to go. In the ocean's skin-cutting cold, wealth and class and status suddenly meant nothing. There was only one question: who gets to live? When the Carpathia finally arrived, what remained was scattered debris and a few hundred survivors shivering in the darkness. More than 1,500 people were gone, not in battle, not to bombs or bullets, but to freezing water and the helplessness of time. In the aftermath, investigations exposed the most painful truth. Titanic did not sink only because of ice. Titanic sank because of the blind certainty that we have everything under control. Maritime laws were forced to change, safety standards tightened, and the International Ice Patrol was created, a late confession that the ocean will always be bigger than human confidence. Titanic was meant to be a monument to progress, but that night she became a monument to a harsher lesson. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't what we don't know. It's what we are certain will never happen. Pompeii was once a place where people believed life would simply keep flowing, peaceful, comfortable, and complete. At the foot of Mount Vesuvius, that Roman city thrived like a vacation retreat for the wealthy. Crowded markets, exquisitely decorated villas, walls covered in frescoes, taverns alive with laughter. People walked along stone streets assuming tomorrow would look like today. And in a city so used to comfort as Pompeii, the most frightening thing was not a roar, but normality. Because before the catastrophe, there were signs. Small tremors would visit now and then, the ground shivering like nature's faint frown. But the people of Pompeii had lived with it for so long that they treated it as routine, something not worth worrying about. They didn't know it wasn't harmless at all. It was the breathing of a giant waking inside the mountain. Then, in 79 AD, Vesuvius stopped breathing. It erupted, not as a single blast that ended quickly, but like a doorway to hell thrown wide open. A column of ash, pumice, and toxic gas shot straight into the sky so high that the heavens became a black dome. Sunlight was swallowed. Day fell into darkness, as if someone had turned off the light for the entire world. And in that darkness, ash began to fall. At first it was dust, then thicker, heavier. Ash and pumice rained down for hours, hammering rooftops, blanketing streets, stealing the breath from human lungs. People coughed and choked, eyes burning, running in panic through screams. Some tried to clutch their valuables. Some only had time to grab their child's hand. Some froze, hesitating, because they believed it will pass. But what killed Pompeii was not only the ash. The worst part came after, and it came so fast there was no time to pray. Superheated surges, waves of scorching gas mixed with volcanic debris, rushed down the mountainside like a firestorm. Pyroclastic surges do not crawl. They do not negotiate. They do not give time. They strike with terrifying speed, hot enough to burn, to incinerate, to end life almost instantly. Pompeii didn't have time to die slowly. Pompeii was snuffed out, like a candle in a violent wind. When everything finally settled, the city vanished from the map. No voices, no markets, no wine-soaked laughter. Only a sea of ash and stone burying Pompeii under meters of volcanic material, one colossal grave for an entire way of life. But history always hides cruel paradoxes. Bodies buried beneath the ash decayed, leaving hollow voids inside the hardened layers. Centuries later, when archaeologists excavated the site, they poured plaster into those empty spaces and created the famous casts of death. Bodies curled tight, hands shielding faces, figures clinging to one another, as if the final moment was still trapped inside the ash. Pompeii was buried, and because it was buried in just that way, it was preserved almost intact for about 1,700 years. In the 18th century, when people finally dug it up, Pompeii was not merely ruins. It was a snapshot of Roman life, frozen at the exact last second. And that is what makes Pompeii haunting, a city that died, yet whose memory survived, because it was sealed deep inside silence. Pompeii reminds us that nature can erase a lifetime in a matter of hours, but it can also preserve human traces through the coldest method of all, not to save them, but to make future generations look and never forget. Ireland in the mid-19th century did not lack faith, and it did not lack hard work. What it lacked was another way to survive. For millions of rural poor, the potato wasn't just food, it was life's foundation. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The one thing that kept a family standing through harsh winters and failed harvests. Back then, the potato was like a single rope tying them to existence. If it snapped, they fell straight into the abyss. Then in 1845, something so small the naked eye couldn't see it arrived. Quietly, like a curse. Phytophthora infestans, a fungus-like pathogen believed to have come from North America. In Ireland's cold, damp climate, it found perfect conditions to spread. It didn't bring cities down with explosions. It didn't set fields on fire. It did something simpler and more ruthless. It turned potatoes into black sludge. Potatoes that looked fine when dug up would rot within days. Soft, foul-smelling, collapsing into ruin, as if the earth itself had begun to betray the people who worked it. In the first year, about half the crop was destroyed. People still hoped it was just one unlucky season. But the years that followed were worse. So much worse that failure became nearly total. And when the potato collapsed, It wasn't only a harvest that fell apart, it was the entire survival system of the poor. In a short time, roughly 1/3 of the population lost its basic food source. But what made the Great Irish Famine a deep wound in history wasn't only nature or disease. It was the painful truth that even as people starved, food continued to leave the island. Ireland still produced grain. It still had livestock. Yet much of it was exported to Britain. Families watched carts of food roll past while their own kitchens went cold. And hunger stopped being just hunger. It became the feeling of abandonment, of being treated as unworthy of rescue. As starvation spread, landlords began evicting those who could no longer pay rent. Roofs were stripped from cottages. Families were thrown onto the road with everything they owned wrapped in a few pieces of cloth. Some wandered looking for work, for a ladle of relief soup, for a place to lie down. And some walked simply to avoid dying where they had once called home. Then disease arrived like darkness following a cold wind. Typhus, cholera. When the body is already hollowed out by hunger, even a fever can be a death sentence. People died not only because they lacked food, but because they no longer had the strength to resist anything. Hundreds of thousands fell, not in war, not in a thunderous natural disaster, but in the terrifying quiet of poverty. And when staying meant waiting to die, people began to leave. Millions boarded ships, crammed into tight, damp, disease-ridden holds. Those vessels would later earn a name that chills the blood: coffin ships. Some never reached the other shore. Some arrived with nothing: no land, no money, no family. Only the memory of hunger's stench and a question that cut deep. Why did I have to abandon my homeland in order to live? By 1852, Ireland had lost nearly a quarter of its population through death and migration. But the greater loss was not the number. It was the scar in collective memory, a pain passed down through generations, reshaping demographics, society, politics, and even the way a nation understood justice. The Great Irish Famine is not only a story about potatoes rotting in the ground. It is the story of a people forced to depend on a single thread of survival. And when that thread snapped, they faced not only nature, but a system that did not reach out in time. And that is why this tragedy leaves us with a chilling reminder. Sometimes what kills is not the storm, but the fragility of life, combined with the indifference of power, at the exact moment human beings need saving most. Christmas in 2004 began like any other holiday. Along tropical shores, shopkeepers opened their stalls, vendors laid out their goods, children ran barefoot on the sand, and tourists laughed in the early sunlight. No one knew that off the coast of Sumatra, deep beneath the ocean floor, a colossal fracture in the earth was slipping, silently, yet powerful enough to pull the world into an unforgettable moment. A 9.1 magnitude undersea earthquake jolted the seabed abruptly, as if someone had yanked a massive rug. The water above could not remain still. It was thrust outward, spreading into tsunami waves that raced across the Indian Ocean, faster and farther than any warning could reach. In many places, the first sign wasn't a roar, but a terrifying silence. The sea withdrew unnaturally fast, pulling the water far back and exposing the bare seabed. Fish flopped in shallow pools. Coral appeared like something unreal. Some people stepped down out of curiosity to gather fish. Others laughed, thinking nature was giving gifts. A false calm, right before the disaster opened its door. Then the waves arrived, not as graceful curls like in the movies, but as a brutal wall of water surging forward and slamming into the shore. Within minutes, The boundary between sea and land disappeared. Homes, roads, ports, power lines, communication stations lifted, snapped, and swept away like toys. People ran, but the water ran faster. People shouted names, but their voices were swallowed by the howl of the current. The chain of waves did not stop in one country. It swept through 14 nations, from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India, all the way to the eastern coast of Africa. One rupture beneath the seabed, yet the pain crashed down on people thousands of kilometers away. An estimated 230,000 never returned. Meals missing faces, homes erased, hands that slipped apart forever. After the disaster, the world surged into an unprecedented relief effort, and from that immense cost, one truth was laid bare. At the time, the Indian Ocean lacked a strong enough tsunami warning system. It was soon addressed like a belated apology. The 2004 tsunami left a cold lesson behind. Nature does not negotiate, and sometimes the scale of loss is not only the sea's power, but whether humans were prepared in time before the water reached the shore. In the early 19th century, in the southeastern United States, many native nations such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were not savage communities as prejudice claimed. They had stable towns, laws, and constitutions. They farmed using Euro-American methods, adapting to survive in a rapidly changing world. But history can be cruel in this way. No matter how far you progress, you can still be swept aside simply because someone else wants your land. The hunger for land among white settlers grew with every new wave of expansion, and when land became gold, people became obstacles. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. On paper, it looked legal. In reality, it was a collective sentence: to leave one's homeland, to abandon ancestral graves, to walk away from the rivers and forests that had sustained them for generations. Even when there were legal victories, even at the Supreme Court, the machinery of policy kept moving forward, and the army was used to turn a signature into forced removal. From 1831 to 1838, tens of thousands were rounded up and driven more than 1,000 miles west to Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. That journey was not a trip. It was an erosion of life itself. They walked through winters that cut to the bone, and summers that scorched the skin, without enough food, without enough water, without shelter. Many had only the clothes they were wearing. Children collapsed from exhaustion. The elderly fell and never stood again. Disease followed like a shadow. Hunger and cold thinned people day by day until life left them as quietly as a breath going out. Thousands died along the way. But the loss was never just a number. It was languages breaking mid-sentence, memories torn from the soil, and cultures ripped from the places they belonged. That is why the route came to be known by a name that needs no explanation: the Trail of Tears. And those who survived when they finally arrived had to rebuild their communities from nothing, on unfamiliar ground, carrying a pain that had no true arrival. The Trail of Tears reminds us that some tragedies do not require natural disasters: no volcanoes, no tsunamis. All it takes is power and greed, and an entire people can be turned into exiles on their own continent. From the 16th to the 19th century, there was a route crossing the Atlantic that was never drawn on maps like other trade lanes. It carried no spices, no gold, no silk. It carried human beings, and turned human beings into commodities. The Atlantic slave trade was not a handful of isolated voyages. It was a vast trafficking system built to feed Europe's colonial economies in the Americas, sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations that demanded endless forced labor. And to replace the lives ground down day after day, They created a hunting machine and called it commerce. Along the African coast, traders established forts and trading posts. Guns, textiles, alcohol, and manufactured goods were exchanged for people seized in wars and raids, sometimes supplied by local powers pulled into the whirlpool of profit. With a single transaction, a family was torn apart. With a single nod, a life was stripped of its name. Then came the most horrific leg, the Middle Passage. In the dark, suffocating holds of slave ships, captives were chained together and packed so tightly they could barely move. The air thickened with sweat, blood, waste, and fear. Food and water were scarce. Disease spread like fire in a sealed room. Violence was discipline. Cries were swallowed by the roar of the sea. The journey lasted weeks, sometimes months, and mortality was so high that death became a cold, calculated part of the cargo's projected loss. Those who survived and reached the shores of the Americas were not saved. They were delivered to auction blocks, measured and inspected like livestock, treated as property. They were sold, renamed, robbed of language, severed from kin. From there, they were driven into forced labor across endless fields, where every harvest season meant another season of pain. An estimated 12.5 million people were forced onto those ships, and nearly 2 million are believed to have died during the crossing. But numbers, no matter how large, cannot fully name what was stolen: childhoods, families, memories, and the basic right to be human. This system endured for nearly 4 centuries, shaping the economies and societies of multiple continents and leaving a legacy that still persists: inequality, racism, fractures that run into the modern world. The Atlantic slave trade may have ended on paper, but its aftershocks have never truly fallen silent, because some crimes do not only kill in a single moment. They continue to live on in the structure of the world, long after the sound of iron chains has stopped. The morning of September 11th, 2001 began like a day that was too beautiful to seem dangerous. The sky was clear, the sunlight gentle, and American streets were filled with hurried footsteps, people holding coffee, thinking about meetings, tuition, dinner. No one knew that within a few hours the world would be wrenched off its old course, and a short label, 9/11, would become an indelible scar in humanity's memory. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners. Cabins that were meant for dozing off, reading the paper, calming a small child, suddenly became places where fear took a physical shape. And then, at 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed straight into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. It tore open the New York sky, shattering not only steel and glass, but the sense of safety people had long taken for granted. Just 17 minutes later, Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At that moment, the world understood. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate attack, cold, calculated, aimed at symbols. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 slammed into the Pentagon, and Flight 93 went down in a field in Pennsylvania. Passengers are believed to have fought back, choosing to rush toward death to prevent the plane from reaching its intended target in Washington. There are moments when courage cannot save life, but it can save what remains of life. As flames rose and structures were torn apart, the 2 towers collapsed. Manhattan disappeared into white dust and debris, as if the entire city had been covered with a vast mourning shroud. Desperate cries calling names, faces coated in ash, papers drifting like snow. These became images no one could watch and then forget. 2,977 people died from more than 90 countries. It was not just a number. It was 2,977 empty chairs, 2,977 unfinished lives, 2,977 families forever split into before and after that morning. After 9/11 came the War on Terror, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and a world of aviation security that would never be the same. But beneath every policy change, 9/11 left an unsettling truth. Sometimes history doesn't need a long war to change direction. Sometimes it takes only one morning and a few minutes for the world to stop being the world we once knew.